Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello and welcome to True Drew Podcast. My name is Avery, and today on our second episode, we're going to be talking about the mystery behind Carolyn Keene. So if you're a true Nancy Drew fan, and of course you are because you're here, you've no doubt seen Carolyn Keene's name on the bottom of countless Nancy Drew book covers, whether they're the original books, the revised editions, or the newer books. And there was a ton of speculation years ago about who Carolyn Keene actually was. People wanted to meet this woman and know more about her because I'm sure people wanted to see, who helped create Nancy Drew, because Nancy Drew is one of the most iconic literary characters of all time. The old saying that truth is oftentimes stranger than fiction definitely applies here in the case of Nancy Drew and who created her. And in this episode, we're going to dive right in and talk about who Carolyn Keene was and how she was just as created and fabricated as Nancy Drew herself. So if you're just getting acquainted with the world of Nancy Drew, Carolyn Keene is in fact a pseudonym. There were many ghostwriters that wrote under the name of Carolyn Keene, including Mildred Ward Benson, who is probably one of the most famous ghostwriters of the Nancy Drew series, Walter Carrig, George Waller Jr., Wilhelmina Rankin, Margaret Scherf, Alma Sass, and Charles Strong. Not to mention, there's plenty of other writers that didn't really probably get the credit that they were due. There was also Harriet Stratmeyer Adams herself, who ghost wrote under the name of Carolyn Keene, but really to understand more about Harriet and just the Carolyn Keene legacy, we should probably go back to the very beginning. So even though the Nancy Drew books were first created, written, and distributed in the 1930s, we have to go all the way back to 1862, and we have a German immigrant family to thank for the creation of Nancy Drew. One Edward Stratmeyer was born in 1862, and he would later go on to create Stratmeyer Syndicate. Now, Stratmeyer Syndicate was very revolutionary for the time. They were publishing several serials, and they had other titles, which you might recognize: the Dana Girls, the Bobbsey Twins, Tom Swift, and the Hardy Boys. And Edward Stratmeyer said that he wanted a series that was geared more towards girls, and Nancy Drew was born. So Edward Stratmeyer started moving forward with this idea for this book series for girls. And it's crazy, but Nancy Drew was not the original name that he was working with. He actually played around with several names like Stella Strong, Diana Drew, and Nan Drew, which is probably the closest to Nancy Drew. But it's just so interesting to think that we almost had a heroine with a different name. So we've arrived at the sad part of this story, and that is the fact that just 12 days after publishing the first Nancy Drew book, Edward Stratmeyer died from pneumonia, so he never saw the success of the Nancy Drew series. And I know he saw the success of several other serials underneath his syndicate, but this kind of blew my mind because I just wonder what he would have thought, about Nancy her stories being adapted into movies and TV shows and games so many years later, and it just really shows how timeless of a character Nancy Drew is. So when Edward Stratmeyer passed away, he left the company to his two daughters, Edna and Harriet, and they were left to run the company and work on distributing all these serials, and so I can only imagine how hard that must have been for them. So we've now entered the era of Harriet and Edna running the Stratmeyer Syndicate, and I don't know, this is me being a little bit of an emotional detective, but Harriet was later quoted in many interviews as saying that Nancy was like a daughter to her, and she was very protective of her character and her image. I mean, you never see Nancy Drew drinking or smoking or doing anything scandalous, and I have to wonder if Harriet might have been so protective of Nancy because that was the last character and the last project that her father was working on before he died. So this is the point in our story when Mildred Wirt Benson comes into play. And she was a very talented writer and reporter, and she had answered an ad for a ghostwriter position with the Stratmeyer Syndicate. So Mildred and Harriet could not have been more different. Mildred was born in Iowa, and she was very outspoken, very unique for her time. She even had a pilot's license in her later years. But Harriet was more, I guess, demure, and from what I've read of her, just more like a traditional woman of that time. And Mildred was only 21 when she answered that ad for the ghostwriting position. And that is so cool to me that she was that young and that talented of a writer. Also, I think that Harriet and Mildred had very different backgrounds. Mildred was more middle class, and Harriet was definitely what you would consider more upper class. I mean, her father had built this booming business, and so there was a little bit of disparity there as well. So here's a few statistics that I thought were kind of interesting about the books. They were originally 224 pages in length and would have sold for 50 cents. And Mildred and any of the other ghostwriters who wrote under the pseudonym of Carolyn Keene were paid $125 per manuscript, which is actually fairly good for that time, but kind of mind-blowing now. But Mildred, we can thank her for writing 23 of the original 30 Nancy Drew books. Now, you're probably wondering what happened to Harriet's sister, Edna, that we mentioned a couple minutes ago. So, Edna took off for Florida several years after her father passed away, and she just expected Harriet to run everything without taking a pay cut, which is so crazy. But Harriet herself asked for raises multiple times over the years, and Edna would always deny them. And so they had a very tumultuous relationship as sisters, and sadly they never got along. They never reconciled, and I don't think they ever saw each other before both of them passed away, which is incredibly sad to me. Because I'm sorry, if I'm running a business with my brother and he just took off to another state and just expected me to run everything and I wasn't getting a raise or anything out of it, I think I'd be a little upset. And I kind of understand why things ended this way for them, but it really just sucks because it's like, you guys could have gotten along and just, I don't know. I just hate it. Now, back to Harriet and Mildred, because that's where the real tea is anyway. But they apparently butted heads constantly because they both had very different ideas of what Nancy was supposed to be like. And for Harriet, Nancy was very much a rule abider and very poised, and you can definitely see it in some of the revised versions of these books because there will be entire chapters just devoted to how Nancy looks and what she's wearing, and just she's very much a homemaker. And then Mildred's version of Nancy was very outspoken. She had no problem standing up to authority figures, and it really shows when you look at the original books versus some of the revised. Now, I think it's safe to say that both of these women greatly cared for Nancy Drew, and without either of them, we wouldn't have Nancy Drew. So I think that there was never a right or wrong, like Team Harriet, Team Mildred. I think they both definitely helped to shape Nancy into the character that we know today. But it's just interesting to see how they both were such strong personalities and they clashed all the time. So in preparing for this episode, I did a ton of research and tried to find interviews done by both Mildred and Harriet, and I found some interesting things. For example, Harriet, before she would autograph any of the books from her syndicate, she would close the cover and see which series it belonged to, and then she would sign the appropriate name on the flyleaf. So if she was signing a Nancy Drew book, she would sign it Carolyn Keene. Or if she was signing a Hardy Boys book, she would sign it Franklin W. Dixon. I think it's very obvious that Harriet had an eye for detail. She appreciated that, and you can tell just by that small, simple action that she really cared about these books. And there were so many within their syndicate that, she was managing, that it was pretty impressive that she would do that. I think that Mildred was very detail-oriented too, though, being a full-time writer. I mean, you have to be. But we have her to thank for Nancy's fiery spirit because you see it in so many of the earlier books. Nancy is not afraid of anything. Okay, so this is the part of the story where things get a little bit ugly. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, the Nancy Drew books started to get revised. So this means that Harriet was revising the books that were originally written by Mildred. And I mean, you look, that's a 20-year age gap from the 30s to the 50s, and a lot had changed culturally in the United States and in the world. And I feel like the Stratemeyer Syndicate was feeling the pushback from people. You know, there were a lot of people saying, hey, some of these books have some really racial things in them, or just things that don't jive with the culture nowadays. So that was probably why Harriet started to revise the books in the first place. So Harriet took this on entirely by herself, and unfortunately what we ended up with, I mean, we got a lot of those racial things out of the books, but then when you read the revised books, some of that stuff is still in there, but you're left with a very watered down version of the original story. Or sometimes I feel like Harriet just threw in these random plot points that make absolutely no sense. So it's just kind of odd. Like, I know that it needed to be done, but it's weird when you read the revised editions and you're like, why didn't they take this out? Now, around this time, the Nancy Drew books have been around for 20, 30 plus years, and there is a lot of mystery and speculation around who Carolyn Keene is. And people were wanting to talk to her, do interviews, and of course, Harriet very early on told any of her ghostwriters, you know, you don't tell anybody that you have written a Nancy Drew book. You don't tell reporters. You don't do any kind of interviews. And she was very protective of Nancy and of the syndicate. So naturally, the reporters and everybody wanted to know even more who Carolyn Keene was. Now, for some reason, late in the game, I don't know if it's old age or what it is, but Harriet starts claiming that she wrote the Nancy Drew books. She wrote them all. She's responsible for Nancy and all of the books, all the plots, and Mildred doesn't like that. I feel like that's a super valid response. Like, if I was a ghostwriter and somebody, I mean, even if I had been paid to be quiet and somebody started saying, yeah, I wrote the books, and started taking credit for every single book, I'd be a little mad. I'd be like, no, I'm the one that wrote these books. You wrote these, but you didn't write all of them. So basically, Harriet is Carolyn Keene now. She just is claiming to be her in every way, shape, and form. And it's doing such a disservice to Walter Carrig and Mildred Wirt Benson and all these other ghostwriters. It's just not cool. I don't know why she did this. I feel like maybe it was just, you know, her sister took off, you know, to Florida, and maybe in Harriet's mind, she thought she was responsible for carrying Nancy's legacy on. But the fact of the matter is, Nancy was built by several people. So here's what happens next. Harriet has been in a contract with Grosset and Dunlap for years. That is who published the original Nancy Drew books. And over the years, when the books were super successful, Harriet naturally asked for more money. And every time, Grosset and Dunlap denied her a raise. So whether you like Harriet or not, I think we can all say that that's not very fair. And although it wasn't a one-man show, she had ghostwriters and she had other people helping her propel Nancy Drew to the success that it was. Nancy Drew books made Grosset and Dunlap a ton of money, and the contract that they had was very outdated and should have been updated throughout the years. But here's the part of the story where things get incredibly awkward. So let's just say you're in a contract with somebody and you don't like the way that person is treating you, whether it's a business relationship or just a relationship, and you just decide, you know what, I'm going to terminate this relationship. What do? You would probably go and tell the person and just be like, hey, I don't think this is working out, or I'm not being paid fairly. I am going to go look for another job. That's probably how you would go about that. This is not what Harriet did. So basically, instead of telling Grosset and Dunlap in a formal letter or anything, Harriet just decides to not say anything to them at all. And so when she's approached by Simon and Schuster, another very big book distributing company and publisher house, she just decides, yeah, let's be in a relationship, Simon and Schuster. Let's go sell books together. And she doesn't say a word to Grosset and Dunlap. So naturally, Grosset and Dunlap is very mad at her. I mean, I can't say I blame them because it's a business contract and that's just not how you operate or conduct business. But anyway, so Grosset and Dunlap files a lawsuit in 1980, and we have a big court case against Grosset and Dunlap, Simon and Schuster, and Harriet Stratmeyer. So naturally, they want to call witnesses to the stand, and they call none other than Mildred Wirt Benson. This is like a mic drop. This is like the equivalent of Regina George coming in, after they find the burn book, even though Mildred Wirt Benson is not a mean girl by any means. But so they call Mildred Wirt Benson to testify on the stand. Simon and Schuster do. And they are basically trying to prove that, Harriet is not the sole writer of the Nancy Drew books, that she had other ghostwriters. And when Harriet sees Mildred in the courtroom, she says, and I quote, "I thought you were dead." Oh, wow. That is like the biggest old lady burn that I have ever heard. It's like, oh, I didn't know that you still existed. You didn't exist in my world. It's like, wow. You can really tell what mind frame that Harriet, was in. And, okay, I'm going to refrain from being biased in my opinion. We'll continue with the story. So Mildred gets up on the stand and she testifies, and basically she's like, yeah, I wrote this, and this. I wrote these 23 books of the Nancy Drew series. And so they are forced to admit in the courtroom that Harriet is not the sole creator of the Nancy Drew books. So therefore she does not own sole proprietorship. And these book distributing companies can do with the character what they want. So this entire court case changes the landscape of Nancy Drew books forever after that, but I think it's in a good way because Grosset and Dunlap still retains the rights to publish the hardback covers, the original Yellow Spines, and Simon and Schuster is able to print paperback books of some of the older and mostly newer versions of the Nancy Drew books. So out of this court case, we see a lot of new books come about, which brings us the Nancy Drew files. Now, I really wish I could have been a fly on the wall to know what Harriet was thinking, because I'm sure this was a huge loss for her, and that's very sad, but I think it was also the direction that these books needed to go. Nancy, for so long, she needed to be modernized, and she needed to be changed and adapted in some ways. I mean, I think that some of these newer books gave us a different side to Nancy. We saw Nancy have more relationships, more autonomy with some of that kind of stuff, and I think that was a good thing. I think it was good for young girls to be able to read that. Now, I did want to read some excerpts from an interview that I found with Mildred Wirt Benson from 1993, and the interviewer asked her, "What do you think of the revised versions written by Harriet Stratmeyer Adams?" And she was quoted as saying, "I wouldn't want to comment on them because I don't read them. She was the owner of the business, so it wasn't my place to think about it. I just accepted it. But some of the rewriting I did not particularly enjoy." Now, I might be reading into this a little bit, but I don't think that I am, because Harriet was the one that solely did the rewriting. I'm pretty sure Mildred didn't rewrite any of the books. The fact that she says she doesn't want to comment on them because she doesn't read them, and then she goes on to say that the rewriting was not something that she particularly enjoyed, makes it sound like she did read them. And I mean, let's be real, like if you wrote some books and then you heard that some people were revising them, you'd probably be a little bit curious and you'd probably want to read them and see like what they changed. And I mean, I think that's natural for a writer to be very defensive of their work. So there were a couple of other interesting nuggets from this interview with Mildred, which further makes me believe that she did read the revised editions, because she got this question from the interviewer that says, "Do you feel that she changed the character of Nancy?" speaking about Harriet. And Mildred said yes, considerably. She made her into a traditional sort of a heroine, more of a house type. Ouch. And in her day, that is what I had specifically gotten away from. She was ahead of her time. She was not typical. She was what the girls were ready for and were aspiring for, but had not yet achieved. Another question that Mildred got in this interview is, what is your favorite novel in the series? And I was very curious to know what her favorite book was. And she said, "I like The Hidden Staircase. They made a movie of that one." A very bad movie. I don't think they read the book when they wrote the movie. Typical of the industry, I guess. And I think she's referring to the movie with Benita Granville, which would have been in like the late 30s, early 40s. And I haven't seen that one, so I'll have to watch it. And the last question that she answered in this interview was, "Do you read Nancy Drew books?" And she said, "No, I never read them at all. I don't think I've ever read a Nancy Drew book since I wrote them. In fact, I'm sure I haven't." I find that a little hard to believe. But you know what? Whatever. I can suspend my disbelief that Mildred never read any of the Nancy Drew books, just like I can suspend my disbelief that some of these crazy plot points in the books happen, like the gorilla mask in Hidden Staircase, but whatever, I digress. So yeah, that is today's episode. I hope this kind of clears up a little bit more about Carolyn Keene and who she was, because she was in fact two very powerful powerhouse women. You had Harriet Stratmeyer Adams, and you had Mildred Ware Benson, and then you had all these other countless ghostwriters, some of which we don't even know, sadly, because there's been so many books and they've been pumped out for years, and I'm sure many of them were written in haste, and sometimes it shows. But yeah, I hope that this was an enlightening episode and kind of gave you a little more background about Nancy Drew and how she was created. So for next week's episode, we're going to start diving into the books, and we're going to start with the very first one, Secret of the Old Clock. So I'm so excited, and I hope you guys will tune in for that. We're going to talk about the book cover, the book plot, everything about Secret of the Old Clock. And I am so excited to start reading these books again because it's been such a long time. Like I said in the episode previous, I was like 8 or 9 the last time I read these books. So I am so excited to experience them again with you all. In the meantime, if you'd like to follow me on Instagram, our Instagram handle is True Drew Podcast, and we post a lot of spoilers and teasers over there about the next episodes, and just a lot of fun like interactive polls and stuff. So if you guys want the latest updates, that's where you can follow us. Until next time, I'll see you guys later. Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. You can follow along on Instagram at True Drew Podcast to see the latest information about new episodes.